Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Most important thing to know about Madison in the years preceding the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was that he spent 7 years involved in intense deliberations. First, 3.5 years in the Continental Congress, from the spring of 1780 to the fall of 1783, and then 3 successive terms in the Virginia House of Delegates, the lower house of the Virginia legislature, 1784, 1785, and 1786. And from those 2 sets of experiences, Madison drew a number of very powerful conclusions about the nature both of federal government, about the relationship of the states to the nation, and also about the nature of legislative deliberation within the states. So Madison, one has to recognize that the Continental Congress was a kind of curious body. The powers it exercised in the 18th century would have been regarded as being essentially executive in nature. That's to say, powers over war and diplomacy. But it conducted itself very much like a legislature. It had roll calls, it had committees, it followed parliamentary procedures in terms of how decisions were reached and discussed. And so Madison thought a lot about the nature of collective deliberation at the national level of politics on the basis of that experience. And then he was term limited out of Congress in the fall of 1783. Anybody who ever thinks about term limits and their role in American history should pause to recognize that Madison was actually the first legislative victim of term limits in American history, because he'd served the 3 years out of 6 that set the limit. So he was term limited out of Congress and goes back to Virginia, and almost immediately is elected to represent Orange County, the county where his house Montpelier is situated, at the state capitol in Richmond. And when Madison went off to Richmond in 1784 to serve his first term in the legislature, he became almost immediately the dominant figure in the Virginia Assembly. And he pretty much retained that status over the next 3 years. There was a point, Madison was so earnest a politician and so assiduous in pursuing the items he felt were really important that he wore out the patience of many of his colleagues. One point, one delegate says that there's no better way to doom a measure than to have Madison supported. But that, I think, was more the exception to his participation there. So he had 3.5 years in Congress and 3 years in Virginia, really thinking about the nature of collective deliberation. Madison was first and foremost a legislator. He was first and foremost a man who derived his political experience from engaging in collective deliberation in bodies that were either legislative in nature or at least followed legislative procedures. So he thought an awful lot about the nature of collective decision-making in a Republican society. A lot of what concerned him had to do with the kind of internal processes of a legislative body, how committees operated, how you could get people to focus on the central issue in a debate. But the more he served, and particularly once he started serving back in Virginia, he also started thinking about the way in which what we might call popular inputs, the role that the people out of doors, or the people at large, or the people themselves would play in terms of conditioning and shaping and influencing legislative debate. That became increasingly one of his concerns by, let's say, 1786, the year before the Constitutional Convention. So when Madison went off to Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, for the great event of the Constitutional Convention, he had, in a sense, 2 sets of concerns on his mind. One was he really didn't want to improve the nature of legislative deliberation. For example, if you think about the 2-year term that members of the House of Representatives serve, the real point of that was that members would, in effect, have to learn their job while they were doing it. Madison assumed, in fact, correctly, that most members of Congress would come and go, that they would serve 1 or 2 terms. They would not be veteran lawmakers. It would be nothing at all like the modern Congress where people serve term after term after term after term. Madison assumed that for much of the time, lawmakers would in fact be amateurs. They would come to the national government and they would really have to learn what they were doing only in the process of doing it. So having a 2-year term would be really helpful. But he also worried a lot about the impact of popular politics, or what he would call the interests, the opinions, and the passions of ordinary citizens on legislative deliberations. And the more he thought about this, the more concerned he grew with thinking about how do you, to some extent, how do you insulate lawmakers from the excessive influence of popular opinion. As a lawmaker and as a deliberator, Madison, I think, had one great advantage that he drew on the basis of his experience. He understood that it was important to try to shape deliberations. He understood that in any legislative body, there might be people like themselves who really were activists in the best sense of the term, who really wanted to prepare and to shape and try to define the agenda from the outset. And then you have a number of ordinary lawmakers, many of them newcomers to the job or people somewhat less committed to the task than he was, who would really need to kind of wait to see how things were going to unfold. So I think on the basis of his experience, Madison understood the importance of trying to frame the agenda from the outset, and that's clearly what he did in Philadelphia. He started his preparations for that probably when he was back at Montpelier in the fall of 1786, or back in Virginia after the Annapolis Convention of September 1786. He had done a course of reading, and he started thinking about the basic problem of federal systems. But it was only in the early spring of 1786 that he starts to pull his agenda together, and he drafts a memorandum that he called the Vices of the Political System of the United States, and several letters to Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, and George Washington, which outlined his basic goals for Philadelphia. I think among those goals, I think the one that mattered most at the outset, that does the best job of explaining his agenda, was actually an insight he'd had back when he served in the Continental Congress in the early 1780s, and it had to do with the basic nature of the American federal system. Under the Articles of Confederation, which in effect was the first federal constitution, drafted in 1776-77, ratified in 1781, essentially we had a system of what I call the voluntary compliance of the states. The Continental Congress would make recommendations, resolutions, requisitions states were supposed to fulfill, but the obligation and the responsibility of fulfilling them really fell to the states acting individually. The states were supposed to do what Congress asked them to do, but to figure out the best way to do it. It was, in a sense, a system of voluntary compliance. And Madison, first when he's serving in Congress, and then when he comes back to Philadelphia, when he's preparing for the convention, actually up in New York City in the spring of 1787, Madison thought really deeply about the nature of that federal system. And what he came to realize was that any system of federalism based upon the voluntary compliance of the states would never work. And he lays out a set of reasons, and it's actually item 7 in the Vices of the Political System. There's a single paragraph, which I think is actually analytically the most powerful paragraph in American political thinking that anyone has ever written, where he tries to explain why did the framers of the Articles of Confederation get this wrong at the beginning? Why did they not give Congress the power to enforce or the power to coerce the states into doing what they were supposed to do? Then he reflects on what have we learned since the Articles were drafted. And then he shifts into this, what we now recognize to be a very modern, we would actually say game theoretic mode of reasoning, where he says, comes rapid fire to 3 conclusions. He says, when states are differently situated, states will have different interests in the outcome of any decision. So you can't rely upon the universal compliance of all 13 states with federal measures. Then he says, within every state, you're likely to find what he calls courtiers of popularity, people who have their own political incentives to run against or to oppose requests coming from the national government. And then third, he says, and what I think is the most interesting point of all, is that even where the states have a latent disposition to agree on the outcome, to agree with the decision, if I doubt that you're going to comply, if I think on the basis of experience the others are not likely to comply, why should I go first? So even when we have a kind of latent agreement on issues, we're in a kind of situation where we're going to wait now to follow me after you. It's going to be more after you than follow me. And so he says this will never fail to render federal measures abortive. Now, that's an insight into the nature of the Articles of Confederation. But what Madison does with this is to come up with an alternative system of government. If you can't rely upon the voluntary compliance of the states, what you need is actually a system of law in the full sense of the term. The national government has to be able to legislate, execute, and adjudicate its own decisions. Once you reach that point, once you say it has to act by law and not by recommendations and resolutions and the like, what you really need is a fully articulated government. You need a government that looks like a normal government. And its members, and then you can think about all the ways in which Americans have been experimenting with Republican governments, going back to 1776, going back to the decision for independence. As Madison makes his preparations for the convention, one point he insisted was absolutely important, was to have the principle of what we now call one person, one vote, proportional representation based either on population or wealth or some combination of the two. He absolutely believed that was, in effect, the sine qua non. That was the kind of a prerequisite for everything else the convention should do. So he was firmly, deeply, adamantly, militantly committed to the idea that representation in both houses of Congress had to be constructed on some kind of proportional formula. It might be that you wouldn't have the same rule in both houses. It might be that one house would be based just on population, the other maybe on population and some form of property. But the idea that you should represent states equally, independent of how many people lived within them or what their wealth was, that was something that Madison absolutely rejected. Of course, he came from the largest state of all. I mean, he came from Virginia, which was, in terms of geography and population, the largest and most populous of the 13 states. So you could simply say he was acting on the basis of self-interest. And to some extent, obviously that must be true, but I think it's true only up to a point. I think the deeper point is what Madison understood, which I think is a critical point for us to grasp, is that whether you're talking about the decisions of elected leaders or whether you're talking about the decisions of ordinary voters, they would never be based on the idea that the size of the state in which you lived would actually define what your preferences were. So if you have think about this for a second. So if you have a system of representation that says we have to reward small states for being small states, in effect you are making size a principle. The very fact of their smallness means that they should have some extra amount of representation to protect their vital interests. That might be true, or that might be a better proposition to argue if you thought that being in a small state actually gave you a different set of interests. But what Madison realized, and you can see how his argument works in his very famous essay, Federalist 10, Madison realizes that our political attitudes are really shaped on other factors. They're based on our what we would call our interests, our opinions and passions. They're based on our material interests. They're based on our occupations. They're based on our religious preferences. They may be based on our family history. They may be based on whether we live in a city or the countryside, or whether we live in a big city or a smaller port or whatever. There's a whole array of factors, many of them of an interest in nature, that affect who we are and what we do and how we think politically. But the size of the state in which you live is not one of them. You can have think about the state, you could have small states that are highly urbanized and highly industrialized. I'd take Rhode Island, for example. Or you could have small states that are much more rural in nature, have much more agricultural population. So, but the key thing is you'll never ask what's good for the small states. You'd ask what's good, you'd ask what's good for the large states. You ask what's good for, what's good for whoever. What are the real social categories of analysis? So I think Madison actually had a very powerful, very powerful political sociology, where he looked at, what is the nature of the interest that drives human political action in a republic like the United States, and the size of a state was not one of them. So therefore, to violate the fundamental rule of justice, to give small states extra representation just because they were small, that might be that might be an advantage they could extract from you, by tough bargaining. But there was no case to be made for it on the merits. So I like to tell my students when I talk about this in class, there is one occasion in which members of a small state will vote on the basis of the size of the state in which they live. It's when you vote on rules of voting, and you can look ahead and see, will I be advantaged or disadvantaged? But if you ask how will you vote after that, it's never going to be a factor afterwards. When Madison left the Constitutional Convention, after it adjourned on September 17, 1787, he was militantly opposed to the idea of having any amendments to the Constitution. His whole strategy for ratifying the Constitution rested on the idea that what you wanted to have happen was to allow the people, speaking through the state ratification conventions, to vote the Constitution up or down, but not to have any kind of conditional amendments to it. Not to, for example, you couldn't say, we will ratify if changes A, B, and C take place. So we'll agree to ratify the Constitution only if other qualifications, other considerations are reached. So Madison was militantly opposed to that. And so he also worried, there was a big movement was afoot. It was supported by his friend, Governor Edmund Randolph, who was one of the 3 delegates who refused to sign the Constitution, to have a second convention, to let the Constitution be debated, try to discover what changes people thought should be made, and then have the convention reassemble and go through those proposed changes. Madison thought that would be a disaster, I think for very good reasons. When the delegates had shown up in Philadelphia in May 1787, they really had very few instructions to guide them. The Delaware delegates did, but Delaware's a small place, who cares? It wasn't that big a deal. If you had a second convention and the delegations came back, from their constituencies, they may come with all kinds of instructions that would make a later agreement very difficult. So Madison was militantly opposed, I think for pretty good reasons, to the idea of allowing the amendment process to go too far too fast. He really worried that the states might propose structural changes in what the framers had done. So he wasn't a big fan of amendments at all. So a couple things happened though, particularly during 1788 as the Constitution was being debated and acted upon by more and more states. One is, a movement does grow in which the Federalists agreed to get the Constitution adopted by original states, let's say by the states originally starting with Massachusetts, to have it ratified but then to propose amendments for the consideration of probably the first federal Congress that would meet once the Constitution was ratified. And that movement did gather enough steam. It was certainly important in Virginia, his own state, where Madison served as one of the Federalist leaders. Virginia was very closely divided. It was really kind of an 8 to 10 vote margin between the two sides, and no one was sure which way the convention was going to go. So Madison somewhat begrudgingly agreed to support the same procedure. We'll ratify the Constitution, but we will propose what turned out to be a fairly extensive list of amendments. Then what happened, well, a couple things happened. One is, so Madison starts thinking, well, what should those amendments be? And then secondly, he gets involved in a very close race against his friend, but at this point his political rival, James Monroe, to represent their district in kind of south central Virginia, around Orange County and Culpeper County, Virginia. And so Madison, as part of his campaign, and it was a campaign in a kind of quasi-modern sense of the term, issues public letters agreeing to support amendments to the Constitution once Congress meets in the spring of 1789. And then what happens, I think, is quite curious. So Madison's on public record as saying he is behind the cause of amendments. So a couple things happen. One is Madison decides the only kinds of amendments that are acceptable are those that will take the form of what we eventually call a Bill of Rights. Actually, Madison didn't want to have a separate Bill of Rights. He wanted to have the articles he wanted inserted right in the text of the Constitution at the point where they would seem most relevant. So there's that concern. So Madison says, some amendments are necessary. We don't want to change anything in the real structure of the government, but we do want to, adopt amendments that will, reflect people's concerns with the absence of a Bill of Rights. I think Madison's other concern here is kind of more deeply political in nature. Madison did not really think a Bill of Rights was necessary on the merits. He didn't think it would do much good. He didn't really think the national government needed to be protected against the kinds of dangers that people worried about. He actually thought the biggest danger to rights will continue to come not from the national government, but from the states. But he did think that the whole process of getting the Constitution adopted would benefit if you could kind of assuage or kind of accommodate well-meaning, if somewhat misguided anti-federalists who did happen to think that some set of amendments were necessary. And that was really, so in other words, there's a body of public opinion out there. It might be, it's still somewhat suspicious about what's been done. It has some anxieties about the character of the Constitution. So if you give this to them, if you do adopt some amendments, you'll help to accommodate them to the Constitution. So that's a very political decision. It wasn't that Madison felt the Bill of Rights would give you a strong basis for legal action. Though it is interesting to note that when he frames the individual articles, he does make significant changes. For example, bills of rights as they've been approved by Americans, going back to the mid-1770s, typically use the verb ought. Meant you were adopting general principles that you hope people would abide by. Madison liked the verb shall. Madison kind of turns the idea of what goes into a Bill of Rights from being a general statement of principles that's really addressed to everyone, perhaps not to anyone. He wanted to actually turn it into a set of legal commands that might be legally enforceable. So he was somewhat ambivalent at best about the real value of having a Bill of Rights, but if you're going to have one, you want to make it the best one possible. And he started to think, I think, in pretty critical ways about what would enhance the very quality of the articles he was adopting, or that he was proposing Congress eventually adopted. There's a long-standing debate among Madison scholars and historians of the early Republic, which kind of pivots around the question, do we have a James Madison problem? Was Madison the same guy in the late 1790s that he was in the late 1780s? And the real pivot for that debate involves juxtaposing one of Madison's most radical propositions from 1787 from the Constitutional Convention with his position in the Virginia resolutions of 1798. So the radical proposition from 1787 was that the national government should have a negative, we would say a veto, but should have a negative on state laws. In Madison's mode of thinking, all state laws, in theory, both which would enable the national government to protect itself from interfering laws from the states, and also in effect to intervene within the states individually to protect minorities against unjust legislation. So he lost that proposal. It carries a bit in the convention, but it goes down and can't be revived. And Madison, I think, remained pretty committed to it. He wrote a very long letter to Thomas Jefferson about 6 weeks after the convention adjourned, in which he defended the negative on state laws at great length. And this was not just a kind of swan song for its defeat. This was really, I think, evidence of how deeply committed he was intellectually to its importance and to the role it should play, or could have played in the national government. So that's one Madison. That's the strong nationalist in the late 1780s. A decade later, when Madison and Jefferson are leading the political opposition, and when the national government when every branch of the national government, the White House, well, actually not yet the White House, the presidency, the White House is being built, but doesn't quite yet exist. But the presidency, both houses of Congress, and the judiciary were dominated by the Federalists. At that point, the Madison, Jefferson, and their Republican Party, the opposition party, who were kind of bitterly opposed to John Adams' foreign policy vis-a-vis France and Britain and so on. At that point, and also bitterly opposed to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which the Federalist Congress had passed to support the administration. At that point, the Republicans had no place to turn but to the states. And so Madison writes the Virginia resolutions, which in effect say that the states must still have some residual political role to play in terms of opposing measures that they think are not just wrong as a matter of policy, but actually raise very difficult and troubling constitutional questions. So a lot of scholars have argued, we have two very different Madisons. There's a strong nationalist in the late 1780s, and there's this kind of architect of a states' rights theory in the late 1790s. And can we square these two positions? I don't find the argument for significant change in Madison all that persuasive. I think the first thing to know about Madison is he was a deeply empirical thinker. He's not just this kind of guy who likes to abstract and think theoretically, about big questions. His best political thinking was done as he's immersed in events. And so what he's got to deal with in the 1790s was the growth of a number of factors that he had not fully anticipated or taken account of back in the late 1780s when he was framing the Constitution. Most important of these, I think, was the growth of the presidency. Madison did not have well-developed ideas about executive power back in the 1780s. He's very kind of cautious and diffident, and he hasn't really fully worked out his notions of what executive power should be. His own primary experience had been in the legislature, been in deliberative bodies. That was the real source of his concern, in terms of his constitutional thinking, his political thinking. But after 1792, for a variety of reasons, particularly because of the primacy of foreign policy, Madison came to realize that you can't control the national government if you don't capture the presidency. And he has to deal with the kind of growth in presidential power that became very dramatic, because after 1792, 1793, issues of foreign policy came to the forefront of American politics. This is all tied to the wars against the French Revolution and the kind of policy the United States should pursue towards Britain and France in that context. So there's a whole set of factors that Madison had to start to think about that he had not really anticipated back in the 1780s. And I think most of what appear to be the changes in his political thinking, it's not that he's just an opportunist, it's not that he's simply following his interests. There's a whole set of issues arose that he had to start making sense of. And of course, once the national government itself became divided, between kind of recognizable political factions, he also had to rethink the role of political parties. So he and Jefferson and those around him, famous guy named John Beckley, not a household name, really started thinking about the mechanisms. How do you organize a political party, and how do you have systematic competition to try to capture and control both Congress and the presidency. I happen to think that James Madison, was, in some way remains our most important, creative, critical political thinker. He was deeply read, very much like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. These guys were well-versed in modern political writings, the writings of antiquity. They were deeply reflective. They did engage in a wholehearted way with the text they read. But Madison had the unique experience of having been, or let's say the distinctive, I think in his case, almost unique experience of having been directly involved in different experiments in constitution making and constitutional enforcement. And he thought a lot about that, and I think he thought a lot about what was necessary to make a constitutional system work over time. Madison lived. Madison dies in 1836. Unless if you lop Aaron Burr off the list, which is where most of us would want to leave him, he really was the last of the founders, the last of the founding generation. And he lives to see witness the nullification crisis in South Carolina in the early 1830s. He witnesses a number of other controversial debates over the nature of the American Union. I think he was very much concerned about the efforts in political life to simplify or oversimplify the nature of the American political system. He lives long enough to see there's a kind of famous set of debates in South Carolina that pivot on the question, we the people of the preamble, is the national government really formed on a vote of, by the decision of the collective people of the United States, or is it really a union of quasi-sovereign states? And of course, Madison's writings of the Virginia Resolution in 1798 did provide part of the foundation for the idea that there was still a confederation of semi-sovereign states. Madison understood that kind of reasoning, to say that the trumping principle is either we the people on the one hand or we the states on the other, that actually was a very dangerous way to reason about political phenomena. So I think a Madisonian mode of political thinking, there's actually a great text for this if you read Federalist 37, which was the first essay in the second printed volume of the Federalist in 1788, is really Madison's statement of a larger theory. So Madison thought then, and continues to act on the idea, that when we talk about political phenomena, when we talk about institutions, when we talk about the division of power between the national government and the states, or the division of power between and among the different departments of government, that political phenomena are not neat, or they're not, to use his language, perfectly accurate, perfectly identifiable in the way that phenomena in nature might be. They are inherently ambiguous. They are inherently kind of soft and kind of polymorphous in their construction. If you want to make the American federal system work, you have to try to describe and understand it in its details. If you just say there's some big principle, we the people authorizes a strongly national government, we the sovereign state seems to point the way towards excessive states' rights, those aren't ways to figure out how the system's going to work. Those are really kind of trump cards you're trying to play to kind of overrule the other side by invoking some grand principle. If you want to make the federal system work at a point in our history where it's clear from the 1830s on, or even the 1819 on, that there are serious sources of tension within it, you have to be patient. You have to understand that the truth of federalism really lies in the details, of the federal system, not in some big overarching principle or some big overarching claim. If you're committed to the Union, you have to try to understand what really makes the Union work. And you have to reason on that basis. If instead you keep escalating the rhetoric by saying, no, no, this principle trumps all, that's not a formula for compromise, it's not a formula for agreement, it's not a formula for consensus. It's really potentially, a formula for disaster. Because you'll get strongly attached to one version of the Union or the other, and what you really need to figure out is there is this big, somewhat, hilly, maybe even swampy, whatever, middle ground in between. And you have to try to survey that. You have to identify its landmarks and then try to respect them. So that's, I think, a Madisonian way of thinking. And of course, the tragedy of Madison's life was that he lives long enough to 1836 to realize that everything he and his colleagues had set out to do in 1787 was potentially in danger.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.